Professor BlackOps, Cybersecurity for the People. Active Directory breached by a nation state, aka SolarWinds. Let's talk about Active Directory breach, hacked, and exfiltrated. So let's go over some best practices, some CIS checks, and my favorite. Let's dig into the Stigs. So let's go. Let's go over an article that kind of walks through that. SolarWinds attack proof that on-premise Active Directory still is an effective initial access vector. In December, disclosure of supply chain attacks against SolarWinds sent shockwaves to the federal agencies responsible for the security of the U.S. information asset. The ripple effect hit the IT community as well. The ripple has continued in 2021, as was already seen as a sophisticated attack on the IT supply chain has taken an additional twist. New evidence points to attackers using well-established methods to gain access the old-fashioned way through an on-premise Active Directory. So the hackers went through the on-premise Active Directory using old-school techniques. So to compromise the SolarWinds build environment, send Trojanized version of updates for the Orion platform. His best-known tactic believes has been used by the threat group behind the attack, the CISA. The threat actors was observed compromising and bypassing federated identity solution and leverage forged authentications token to move laterally to the Microsoft Cloud environment. So once again, we're going to dig into how to lock down Active Directory on-prem and in the cloud. So let's go. Let's fire up the PowerPoint slides. So if you see on the slide, Active Directory breached by a nation state. So over here is the on-prem solution of that. Then up here is the cloud. So see, these are two Active Directory forests. So you don't have to use different accounts. You actually take your on-prem of Active Directory tenant and sync it to your Azure tenant. Right. So if you hack the on-prem tenant, of course you're going to be have access to the cloud version. So these are the two Active Directories that we're going to lock down: Active Directory on-prem and Active Directory in the cloud, more specific, Azure. So let's go over some of the Stig checks. These are all going to be high critical, high impact if you don't get them done. So 8534 is a hot interconnection between DoD directory services as different classification levels must use a cross-domain solution that is approved for use in inter-classification cloud. So on a regular company, right, you're going to have your DMZ, you're going to have your classified internet, then you're going to have your unclassified internet. Your classified is going to be social security numbers, HIPAA, FERPA for education, and IRS, right? So those are going to be your two different classification clouds. And control interface must have interconnections among DoD information systems operating between DoD and non-DoD systems. So what's the control interface? When you're going between, once again, your secure and your non-secure. Interface could be firewall rules, MFA for you to actually log into your high classified network. So there's a number of techniques you could use for classified and unclassified. Right, so these checks right here are for your on-prem Azure Directory. Membership to the enterprise admin group must be restricted to the accounts only managed at the Active Directory for us. So right, we're going to take our privileged accounts and we're going to actually lock them down so they can only use certain job functions, aka least privilege. Membership to the domain admin groups must be restricted to accounts used only to manage the Active Directory domain and domain controllers. Once again, we're locking down those accounts those accounts shouldn't be used very often. And on top of that, if we're using domain admin accounts, those accounts should definitely have MFA cut on. Delegation of privileged accounts must be prohibited. Delegation means I'm delegating it to another user or delegating it to a service account, right? There's no delegation. Whoever has that privilege should be the only one using that privilege. Medium of VPN must be used to protect directory network traffic for directory servers, implementation spanning enclaves and boundaries. So a lot of times you have different Active Directory forces in different locations, different domains, right? So you want to control that traffic to go through a VPN. So now we're going to talk about the Active Directory in the Azure part. Once again, I'll put all the checks in the description of the video, so you can see the majority of them. If also, you can actually reach out to my email, and I'll actually send you the PDF or the Excel spreadsheet if you need those. So these are actually CIS checks. The Stigs didn't actually have Azure checks yet. So we're actually going to use the CIS checks. So usually I go Stigs, CIS, best practices. So when I lock it down, I call that the ultimate blue team requirements for locking down systems. Once again, we're talking about the Azure AD. Ensure the multi-factor authentication is enabled for our privileged user. It's actually a manual check. Level 1, enable the authentication for our credential users who write access to the Azure resource. This include roles like service co-administration, subscription owners, and contributors. Right, those are simple groups that should also have MFA turned on. Also, as part of that, go to the Azure directory, go to users, go to all users, click on multi-factor authentication button on the top bar. 5, ensure that the multi-factor authentication status is enabled for all users who are on service account, co-administration owners, and contributors, right? So that's the location you actually cut on MFA in the Azure cloud. 1.9, ensure the users can consent to apps accessing company data on their behalf. Require administrators to provide consent for the apps before use. So a lot of times when you go into a new app and it says this is a government app or this is the level of security for that app, you'll be fine. You actually have to opt in to using that app. So that's what they're talking about here. And once again, unless the Azure Active Directory is running as an identity provided for third parties, do not allow users to use their identity outside the cloud environment. User profile contains private information such as phone numbers, email addresses, which could then be sold off to other third parties without requiring any further consent for the app. Right, so those are different checks to be able to consent in to using the app. Ensure the users can add gallery apps to their access panel. It's set to no. Description requires administrators to provide consent for apps before use. So we're not going to let people download willy-nilly apps. We're only going to let them download apps that are used for our agency or just for their job description and their job function. Unless Azure is running as identity provider third app, do not allow the users to identify outside the cloud. Then be sold off to third parties requiring any further consent for the user. 1.11, users can register applications is set to no. Requires administrators to register third-party app. Rationale is recommended to let administrator register custom development applications. This ensures that the application undergoes a security review before exposing those to the Active Directory data. So hopefully you review, especially since the SolarWinds, hopefully you're reviewing all your third-party applications before you put them on the network. I'm by no means stating that if people were reviewing that application from SolarWinds, it still wouldn't happen. But that's a nation state. So we need to be comfortable with all the applications on our network and just take that seriously of what apps that we know are running on our network. And we at least did a high cursory security view on those apps. Ensure the restrictive access to Azure Ad Administrator portal is set to yes. Restriction access to the Azure AD Administrator Portal is set to Administrator only. The Azure AD Administrator Portal has sensitive data. All non-administrators should be prohibited from accessing any Azure AD data in the Administrator Portal to avoid exposure. Ensure the Active Directory admin is configured. Use Azure Active Directory authentication for authentication with SQL databases. Ensure the Active Directory authentication is a mechanism to connect to the Microsoft Azure SQL database and SQL data warehouse by using identities in the Azure Active Directory Azure AD. Right, so when you log in the database, you wanted to be sure that you're using the Active Directory credentials that are in Azure, so you're not creating duplicates or spreading your data out. So these are some things from the CIS checks you want to make sure you're doing. Harden Azure AD against attacks, which some have dubbed SolarGate. Do not allow users to grant consent to unmanaged applications. Enable password hash sync if the hybrid, if your synchronization is hybrid. Enable policies to block legacy authentication. Also enable the self-service password reset. Right, because a lot of times when you're sending passwords around, they're not encrypted. The self-server console on the side of Azure takes care of the encryption, delivering your password secure, making sure when you get your password, it'll make you reset it to a new password in case anybody's seen it. Those are some of the built-in features of Azure. So you want to take advantage of those features. Enable our users to complete multi-factor authentication for secure access. Require multi-factor authentication for administrator roles. Turn on sign-in risk policies. Turn on users risk policies. Use limited administrative roles. Deploy Azure AD password protection on-prem to eliminate common passwords. So Azure has this complex, super dark web password protection. It can actually protect your Active Directory on-prem, and it'll look for common passwords that's known on the dark web. So it has a lot of built-in features you can actually use. So automate threat response. Azure Active Directory has capabilities that automatically intercept attacks to remove latency between the detection and response. You can reduce the cost and risk when you reduce the time criminals use to embed themselves into your environment. Your normal hacker is usually is in your environment for at least a year before they're actually found. Right, here are concrete steps you can take. Implement users risk security policies using Azure Active Identity protection. Sign-in risk is likelihood someone other than the account owner is attempting to sign into the user's identity. A sign-in risk policy is a conditional access policy that evaluates the risk level to a specific user or group. Based on that risk level, high, medium, low, a policy can be configured to block access or force multi-factor authentication. Make sure you force multi-factor authentication on medium or above risk when people are signed in. So here's the sheet. It shows you right there that Doug has logged in. It was 3 instances. It tells you if it was active. Then it assigns a risk level to Doug's computer. Right? It looks for IP, where they logged in, what country they have in. So it has the basics for giving you that risk, low, medium, or high. Then with that risk, you can figure out if you need to block the account. So once again, we just went over some high-level checks for Active Directory. Some of the checks was on-prem, and some of the checks was in Azure Cloud. Because nowadays, let's go up to that top diagram. There it is. So you have your on-prem, then you have your Azure, then you syncing them, right? So how do you lock down to make sure if somebody attacks your on-prem network, they won't be able to sync those credentials and get into your Azure account where you're probably using Office 365, You can view your emails. Because of the few federal companies that was hacked, the hackers was actually able to read their email because, once again, they stole their on-prem directories and actually got to their Azure cloud, right? So we need to make sure we lock down both of these Active Directories. So once again, in the check, I'll have some Stig checks for you. I have some CIS checks, and I have some best practices, right? We're trying to be the ultimate blue team and get it locked down. Once again, Active Directory breached by a nation state, aka SolarWinds. Let's lock it down, aka the blue team. Cybersecurity for the people, Professor Black Ops. Please subscribe.